think we're all here. I'm going to introduce Joe because Joe has put these wonderful speaker programs together. He has something going on every month. So if any of you are new here, please join us because we have all these wonderful things going on. And Joe will have the honor of introducing our speaker.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Excited for the event? All right, great. I know I talked to a few of you when you first came in, so I'm liking that everybody's here to welcome Dr. Gregory Spriggs. So just a little bit about Dr. Spriggs. He's from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He's currently the nuclear weapons physicist in the design physics department. And part of his job is what he'll talk about tonight, which is a film scanning and reanalysis project. So they take 7,500 pieces of footage, scientific films from EG&G, and they go back over it, scan them, and they get back some of that benchmark data using newer technology. So really taking what we had from before and implementing it in a new way, getting more data. So a really fascinating project, how we can go back and mine some of that stuff for more data. And prior to going to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, he was also at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and for that at the General Electric. So really want to thank Nelson Cochran here. He's our vice chairman of the board, and he really helped get us in contact with Dr. Spriggs and helped facilitate this and get this going. And I know for me, it's been one of the ones I've been looking forward to since it was announced. So I think without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Gregory Spriggs.
I would like to thank the Atomic Museum for having me give this talk. I love this particular project. This has been the most fun project I've ever worked on in my life. I'm a little reluctant to talk about it at times because there's some things about photography that I know nothing about. I have a very shallow knowledge of photography. I'm a web designer, and so when they gave me this project, I could spell film, and that was about it.
I took wireless mic for you.
My voice carries. Does anybody need to hear the microphone? Okay. The motivation for this project, about 10 years ago, my boss, a guy that John Brown and I were just talking about, Charlie Burton, he hired me at Livermore and wanted me to work on a project. Is this even working? You can hear it? Yeah. Okay. He wanted me to work on a project having to do with nuclear weapon effects, and I wrote some codes, and he told me that he wanted me to compare it to some experimental data. And I went to the literature, and I pulled out some data, and of course the code didn't agree with it. And Charlie looked at me and said, well, where'd you screw up? And I said, it wasn't me, it's going to be the data. So he said, well, go prove it. So it turned out in our archive, we had about 250 original films from EG&G of the atmospheric test. And so I convinced him to pay for those films to get scanned through a commercial company that was over in San Francisco, and I reanalyzed it. And lo and behold, I did not get the same answers that EG&G got years before. In fact, some of the answers were off by about a factor of 2, sometimes a factor of 3, but most of them were off, plus or minus 20%. So Charlie said, you're it. You're going to reanalyze all the films because we need benchmark data. So this is how I got started on the project. And before I go too much deeper into it, I'd like to introduce some of my coworkers here because this project would not have happened without these other guys. First guy is Alan Carr, who happens to be the lab historian at Los Alamos, and he's also the custodian of the film collection. So I contacted Alan and said, we're interested in scanning all the old atmospheric test films so that we can reanalyze and get benchmark data. And Alan said, this is great. We have all these films in the archive, and not a single projector exist at Los Alamos. We couldn't show this film if we wanted to. So he says, I got 2 requirements. Number 1, they're old films and they're very valuable historically. And he said the other thing is that that he would like to get a copy of the scans after we've scanned it so that he could go around and give talks and show it and so forth. And he said, but there's a real problem here. You got to be able to handle these films. Can you prove to me that you guys know how to handle films and you're just going to not mess it up? So I went out and I found a couple guys. One right here, Pete Coran, it's on this side over here, Pete and Jim Moy. And these 2 are film experts, and between them they have about 80 years of experience, and I will talk about Jim first. Jim Moy works for a small company over in San Francisco called Monaco, Jim is well renowned in the film industry for being very good with films, preserving it and repairing it and so forth. In fact, the Zapruder film, which is the film of President Kennedy being assassinated, after our president was assassinated, the Secret Service took the film, and they've only made 4 copies of it since 1962. And the 4th copy they made was by Jim. By Jim. They came to him and they said, "You're the only person that we trust in the United States to actually handle this film and make another copy of it." That's how well respected he is in the film industry. So Jim's a big plus. So he's our scanning expert. And then we have Pete Grant, who was famous for making Trinity and Beyond. And he also wrote this book. This is really a great book down here. You can get this on Amazon. Actually, I think you can get this in your gift shop, yes. So this book here is really a fascinating book to read. A lot of pictures in there and a good history of the atomic bomb photography. Pete also won an Academy Award, not for acting. He won a Scientific Academy Award for his film restoration technique that he invented. So, highly respected man in the film industry. In terms of the analysis, I got lucky. I met a guy who came to Livermore on a tour with some Air Force cadets. His name was Ben Kowash. Ben is an image processing expert, and here we have all these films. They've now been digitized, and we needed to figure out a way to analyze these things and automate the process because there are about 9,000 films, and it's very tedious to do by hand. So I got lucky, and Ben has been working here. Ben has been working here as a stockpile associate. He is a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he's due to rotate out in next June. And then finally, my little troop of cadets. Every year, Livermore hires about 600 summer students on that order, plus or minus 100 or so, and about 100 of those come from the military academies. And we advertise job projects that we like the students to do, and then the students look through it, and then they apply for the job. And it turns out that I get about 6 or 7 cadets every year from the Naval Academy, from West Point, and from the Air Force Academy. And they come in and they help me do the analysis. They write some of the analysis tools using MATLAB or Python or Java or whatever it is. It's really great. These guys are really sharp. It's unbelievable how smart they are. And from this, they usually end up writing a technical paper. And they go through the lab process and so forth, and they actually publish this in peer-reviewed journals, or they go to national conferences and present papers on this particular subject, on the analysis of some of their work. So, brief history of EG&G. Again, this is where I feel very uncomfortable because, number one, I'm a weapon designer, not a film expert, and number two, I wasn't there. So what I know about this, I got from technical documents, and so I'm sure there are people out there who are going to look at this and say, no, this is all wrong. Wrong. Please tell me this, because I need to know what the right answer is. But if you look at the history, when it first started out, I guess the photography was assigned to Los Alamos and to a division here called the Photographic and Optics Division here, and they also shared this responsibility with the Army Air Corps. The Air Force wasn't in existence at the time. This was actually the Air Force that was owned by the Army itself. And they did the photography on Trinity and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and on Operations Crossroad in 1946. Trinity went off okay, but these 2 shots right here, these weren't really tests. They messed up on the photography there, and I guess the only film that was actually taken of these 2 shots was from Harold Agnew, who took a shot with a private camera on the bomber that bombed Hiroshima. It's the only film that we have of Hiroshima. There was no films in Nagasaki because the pilot the crew member that was supposed to run the cameras, they didn't have a parachute for him, so they kicked him off the plane. Nobody knew how to run a camera. So there were no film records of Nagasaki. Okay? So after Crossroads, the Army stood up, the Air Force stood up in September 1947, and they went ahead and said, well, let's let Los Alamos concentrate on designing weapons and let the Air Force do the photography. So this particular squadron was stood up, and they were responsible for doing the scientific filming and also for doing the documentary filming. And the documentary filming was done under this studio called Outlook Mountains Studio. It was down in Hollywood someplace. Big facility. So they did that, and then it became obvious that the Air Force didn't actually have the expertise to do high-speed photography, so they hired EG&G. And EG&G started in 1947. And they did all the atmospheric operations here from 1951 all the way up to 1962. And we stopped doing atmospheric testing in 1962. Here's a picture of the 3 guys. They were all from MIT. Edgerton was famous for doing high-speed photography, and these two guys were, actually, Greer here in the middle was the one who designed the firing and timing system for the Hiroshima bomb, or I'm sorry, for the Nagasaki bomb, for the implosion bomb in here. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this. Gerhausen? German? Germanhausen, okay. I should know that since I'm German. Oops, I pushed the wrong button. So we were looking to see how many films we need to scan here, and we did just a quick count here. Here's the number of atmospheric tests that were performed by category here, airburst, airdrop, balloon, and so forth. And there were about 210 shots, and probably out of that there were about 30 safety shots where there wasn't a yield, so you wouldn't expect to see much. So out of this, there were probably maybe 181 shots that had a measurable yield, and each EG usually uses about 50 cameras per shot. So if you just multiply it out, we think there are about 9,000 scientific films that are out there someplace. And the average number of frames per film is around 2,000, and so we're talking about scanning about 18 million frames total when the project is over. And we're about halfway done, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later here. So, just a little history about the films themselves. When the testing here was going on, there was a technical report that we saw from Kodak that said that they, in support of this test program, they had actually tested over 800 different film types. These were different emulsions on different types of film base, just to see if they could come up with a better film that had a larger dynamic range. When nuclear detonation occurs, the light output changes by about 12 orders of magnitude. The best film that Kodak has ever made only captures 4 orders of magnitude of light variation. So you have to stagger these cameras, and you have to put optical filters in front of it in order to catch a larger dynamic range. And so if you look at the sensitivity of you and I, this is the response up here. This curve, as this thing goes up, your eye is more sensitive to it, so it's more sensitive in the green. And if you look at some of the films that were developed by Kodak, it was finally when they got down to the panchromatic film here that this distribution or sensitivity was almost the same as the eye. But they went on to develop other films, realizing that some of these fireballs, as they cooled off, they were still putting off infrared, so they developed an infrared film that was sensitive so you could see other parts of the detonation. In fact, here's one of the pictures of it. Here's the infrared. Most of these shots were done early in the morning, so it wouldn't mess up the fireball photography. And so it was hard to see the lake cloud that formed through all the haze and the morning mist. And so they use this IR film, and you basically, because all the heat was being given off of this cloud, it's still pretty hot, you could actually see it. So a big improvement here on the lake cloud photography. Then they had another kind of film. They were trying to make the optical density range larger. Instead of 4 orders of magnitude, they wanted to find film that would do 5 or 6 orders of magnitude. And they came up with this extended range film, and basically they had 3 different layers, 3 different film speeds on here with some colored dye. So when it was really hot, you got this sort of a black dot here. And as it cooled off, it went through reds and back down to yellows again. And this effectively increased the range of the film by about a factor of 3. So this was a big improvement. And we have some of these films that we're scanning also, trying to reanalyze them. The big problem, they use these films primarily to figure out the yield. And they used an equation by a British scientist by the name of Geoffrey Taylor, who derived an equation for a shock wave in air. And he said, if you could measure the position of the shock wave as a function of time, you can figure out what the yield was from that device. And so they said, but in order to capture that shock wave, you have to have a high-speed camera. Normal film runs at 24 frames a second in an intermittent camera. Intermittent camera, basically you take a piece of film, you put it behind the lens, you stop it, you open up the shutter, you let light in, it exposes the frame, you close the shutter, then you move the film by 1 frame, open the shutter, let light in, close it, move it again by 1 frame, and you do that 24 times a second. In order to do this kind of photography they were looking for, they have to do that 2,400 times a second, a factor of 100. So they had to have some other kind of a camera other than an intermittent camera in order to do this. And so they came up with these 2 cameras here, FastTech, which was actually developed by AT&G, and Eastman Kodak had come up with another camera, this high-speed camera. And I want to show you the principle of this, because this is kind of a fascinating topic here of this high-speed photography. You have to understand it in order to analyze these films. But here's the lens and light coming in, and they had this prism between these 2 blocks here. And this prism would direct the light onto this film, and this film was moving continuously behind the lens. So this film was going at some speed, maybe 500 frames a second, or even faster than that. And this lens, the light would come in, the prism would bend it and shine it onto this film, and as the film moved, the lens would rotate. The lens and the film were actually coupled together mechanically. And so you would shine this image on here, and that would give you enough time, enough exposure on the film to actually capture that image. All right, so I want to show you a film that shows this, because this picture doesn't do it justice. I just have to get out of PowerPoint for a minute. We found this on the internet.
To see things better. To see things better. This is the job of a high-speed camera. You've just seen pictures taken at a rate several hundred times faster than normal projection speed. You've seen fast action that was once lost in a blur of motion. Such pictures are possible because the camera transports the film in a smooth, continuous motion instead of stopping it for each frame. The taking lens places an image on the film just about the same as any camera. But the film passes the aperture so quickly, it would seem it could never catch and hold a sharp image. This roll of film, hundreds of seconds of projection time, can catch an event of 1 second or less. To see how a sharp image is formed, let's blow this action down. With the cover and aperture removed, you can see the prism which is between the lens and the film. The prism, turning as the film moves, sweeps the image with the continuous motion of the film. An aperture plate restricts the image to the desired frame area of the film. But let's see how this engineering analysis tool is put to work. In the research and development, in scientific investment.
Anyway, this type of camera was very important to the test program. And the reason was because they could run the film at 2,400 frames a second or even 3,000 frames per second. And those particular cameras I was just talking about, let's see if we get this back into the this looks good. Forward again. I get it. There we go. These two cameras were basically the workhorse for the photography for the atmospheric shots. They captured the shock wave as a function of time using these high-speed cameras that were prism cameras. And this, what they would take, and on any particular shot, they might have anywhere from 10 of these cameras to 15 of them filmed in the same shot, just in case one of them failed. And a lot of times they did fail. And so there were a lot of films that were called fireball films, which were filmed with these high-speed cameras, and they would run anywhere from about 2,000 frames per second up to about 3,000 frames per second, which was fast enough to capture the shock wave. But they had a problem with those cameras. The roll of film that went on the inside was only about 100 feet long. And so if you ran the film at 2,400 frames a second, it went through the film very quickly. So they had to wait to start the camera until the detonation was about to occur. So they would start the cameras anywhere from about a half a second to about a second and a half. The film would come up, or the camera would bring it up to speed, and they would catch it. You know, they didn't know exactly where it was going to be. It was sort of a random thing, but they would finally catch the detonation when the camera was running maybe at 2,500 frames a second or 2,000, whatever. They usually had a target number, and by knowing that particular camera and how the motor accelerated, they could just about nail what the frame rate would be during the detonation. But the problem was that those cameras were not synced to time zero. They weren't synced to when the detonation occurred. And if you look at the time, you need to capture that shock wave at a precise point in time. And if you don't know when the detonation occurs, then you're going to get some uncertainty. And for the low yield stuff, this was a very big uncertainty. You could change the yield by almost a factor of 2 just by not knowing when the detonation occurred. So they came up with another camera. This was designed by EG&G, a guy by the name of Charlie Wyckoff. And this is called a Rapitronic camera. It was a very clever camera here. It stood for Rapid Action Electronic Shutter. And what it was a camera that took a single snapshot. And they used the trigger, the gamma pulse coming off of the detonation to trigger the camera. Then they had these delay circuits that would then trigger each of these individual Rapitronic cameras. Now what made these cameras unique was that it used a crystal as the shutter. And what they did was they had 2 crystals that were basically crosswise with each other, and that would block the light, and they would put a strong electric current across it, and they would reorient, and the light would come through the crystal, take the electric current off, and it goes back to where it was. So they could open and close the shutter in 4 microseconds. So by having the thing start off with a gamma pulse and then opening and closing that shutter in 4 microseconds, they were able to capture very precise moments in time on that shock wave and then measure it. And here's some pictures taken from Rapidtronic here. So here's one that's taken a little bit early. This was Whitney, it was a 19 kiloton tower shot. And it was very early, it was a tower, and you can see the tower here. But basically you had high energy x-rays coming off from the hot plasma that went out into the air here, it caused scintillations, and it actually captured that feathering look here. So we have lots of Rapidtronic cameras that at very early times you see this feathering. But later on, as the shock wave sort of slows down, you get a nice round fireball like this. So here's climax. This is a 61 kiloton airdrop here, and you can see the fireball there on the shock wave front, and you can measure that very precisely, probably to within maybe 0.1%. And the precision time, because of the timing circuit, they knew exactly when that camera took this snapshot. So they were able to use these Rapidtronic cameras, and in conjunction with the films, with the prism cameras, in order to normalize the films, the prism cameras, to figure out when time zero was on each of those films. And then they got a continuous picture of the shock wave as a function of time with the right time scale. For some of the earlier or later stuff, as the shock wave moves out further and further away from the detonation point and slows down, and then you get to this early cloud behavior and the late cloud behavior, they started using these 35 millimeter films here. These were running actually anywhere from 1 frame per second up to maybe 125 frames per second. And the 70 millimeter cameras were a much bigger format, which they needed to capture the late cloud stuff because it was so big. They would use these different 70 millimeter cameras in order to capture it. And then they also use these K17 aerial cameras. The film format in that, the film is literally 9.5 inches high. It's a huge format. I mean, it's the roll may be like this, but the film is that high. And so we have to scan that on a flatbed scanner 1 frame at a time in order to get it done. But our other scanner can scan 70 millimeter and 35 millimeter automatically. And here are pictures of the 3 different cameras. This camera, I wish they had come up with this much earlier in the test series. I wish they had used it more consistently. It was called a slit camera. General Radio was actually another subsidiary of EG&G. And they invented this camera here. Basically, it was the same sort of camera where the film was moving continuously behind the lens. But instead of having a rotating prism, they just simply had some slits in basically a lens cap, okay, which allowed light in. And when the light came in, they would make a streak onto the film here. So they're also called streak cameras here. And they got different intensity lights here because they would put an optical density filter sheet across here so that they would guarantee that at least one of the streaks wasn't saturated. So it was very clever. And also they could put color filters in front of these slits so that they could also look at spectral effects as a function of time when the fireball was evolving. We took the streak cameras here, when we scanned them, we're able to get, for a typical 35 millimeter scan, we're able to get 2,186 pixels across here. So every pixel row across here represents 1 data point in time. And every pixel represents about 8.5 microseconds in time for us to look at the light output from nuclear detonation. And from that, we're able to plot then the light output, and you can see the characteristic double light pulse from a nuclear detonation in an atmospheric test. On each of these curves, it represents about 20 million data points per streak. Lots of data. They could not have done this in 1950. In fact, they took these films, and I never saw anything in the literature that said they analyzed them. And it was because it was so hard to get the optical density as a function of time off of this. It was almost like they were waiting for me to do this. They knew I was coming. Eventually, somebody was going to do this. And these films are just absolutely priceless. We've got maybe about 100 of these right now, but there were a couple operations like Teapot, they stopped doing it. They did 14 shots and didn't use a single streak camera, which is kind of disappointing for us. But anyway, we really like these streak cameras. And I'm going to show you a film of that streak a little bit later here. All right, here's the big problem. Film is not forever. Film is made out of organic material. So you have a base, a piece of plastic that they put it on of some sort, and then they put the emulsion on the top, and the emulsion has maybe silver halide crystals in it, which turn dark, which makes the film explode and so forth. But it's all organic, and it's going to decompose no matter how well you treat it, no matter how nicely you store it, it is gonna rot. And so that's the problem here, is we have a bunch of films that the clock is ticking. In fact, Kodak did a study, and they said if you have a black and white film that was filmed on cellulose acetate base, even if you store it perfectly, these conditions here, it's only gonna last about 100 years. And we're about 55, 60 years into this. And so these films are already starting to fall apart. This is the point at which the film is basically, you open up the can and it's dust. Okay? And if it were done on polyester, it'd be 500 years, but polyester didn't come along until about 1963, 1964. So none of the atmospheric tests were actually filmed with polyester. And then color film fades almost immediately. You can take a color film and within a year, and all the colors are gone off of it. So here's some of the films that we've scanned so far. You can see the emulsion is starting to flake off. All those black flakes right there, that's the emulsion just flaking off of the film. Here's another film. This was Fireball, I think it was Climax, and you can see this big long streak here of emulsion that's fallen off. There's the emulsion that's flaking off there. This happens quite often on these films. As we open up the cans, these cans haven't been open in 60 years. We're finding a lot of deterioration here on the emulsions. They're flaking. Big problem here, film likes to shrink, especially if it's near moisture. And it doesn't shrink uniformly along the length as it does across the width. And so when you get this change in shrinkage, it causes things like buckling and fluting, twist and curling and spoking and embossing. Big problems there. And then there's another problem here, is that when the film shrinks, film was designed to be run through negatives were designed to be run through a developer, not through a projector. Projectors are designed to run prints, and the holes between, or the distance between the holes on prints is slightly bigger than the holes between negatives. So you can't run these films through a sprocket machine. You will rip them up. And you can see a picture here. We took a picture of one of them. We tried to run through one of our sprocket machines. We stopped because the shrinkage was too much. So shrinkage is a big problem. And of course I mentioned the color fading here. This is what it looked like before. And Pete Coran, he kind of doctored it up and said, I think this is what it might have looked like originally, just to show a difference here. But this is how the film is completely faded away. So EG&G was using a lot of colored film initially, and they sort of backed off from it. For one, it didn't have the dynamic range they needed. Color film only has a dynamic range of about 2 orders of magnitude, whereas black and white has 4 orders of magnitude. So they said, we really don't want to use color because we can't capture enough of the light output from the fireball. But it fades anyway. All right, there you go. And the film, the emulsion is very sensitive. When they were reading it back in the 50s, they had what was called a cotograph, and up here at the top, you can see a reel on one side and a reel on the other. Basically, it was a hand crank. You just kind of pass the film through this cotograph. And what it was is an image enlarger. So it would take an individual frame and it would shine it down onto a base down here. There was usually a circular grid, and they would measure the fireball by enlarging this image onto this grid and saying this is what the radius of that image is, of that particular fireball. So when they handled it, a lot of scratches got put into the film, which is unfortunate. A lot of our film, when you look at these now, you're going to see many, many, many scratches. We didn't do it, they did it. So EG&G said, well, I got an idea. Why don't we put a lacquer on the film, and that'll protect the emulsion from getting scratched, which was great, except the lacquer turned yellow. Not good. And then if you try to remove it, if you don't use the right chemical, within a couple of days, this is what happens to the film. It completely deteriorates. So the lacquer really does do harm to it. So we just said we're going to leave the lacquer on and just live with it, even with it being yellow. And then a big problem here, big problem. On cellulose acetate film, when it decomposes, one of the byproducts is vinegar. And so you get this syndrome called vinegar syndrome, which basically eats through the film and makes it useless. It'll turn it into goo, and then after it dries out, it turns into dust. And so vinegar syndrome here starts to eat into these films. And if you have these films stored in a can that's sealed, it accelerates. When you store film, you want to put it in a film that has air vents in it so you can circulate those and get those gases out of that can. And these cans that were used by EG&G were not archival cans. These were just temporary cans you put them in, and they sealed it up too tight. So every time we open up a can now, you get this waft of vinegar that you can smell from these cans, and telling us that vinegar syndrome is on its way. And if you do this with nitrate, if the film was on cellulose nitrate instead of cellulose acetate, it decomposes even faster. It doesn't produce vinegar, but it's just another decomposition process. And cellulose nitrate decomposes probably a factor of 3 faster than cellulose acetate. So, we opened up some Trinity films. Trinity was filmed in 1945, and we opened up these cans, and it was on nitrate, and you can see 3 of the cans. This was 3 out of 6 that we opened up. The other 3 were also just as bad as this. They had all decomposed like this. They're worthless now. Can't do anything with it. No. So Alan, his ears perked up. He said, "Yeah, we got to do something about this." So Los Alamos made a film. If you don't mind, I'll show it to you. Sorry, I got to move a couple things here for a second. I'll get it. I'm not going to get it. Where's it at? Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Right in front of me.
Los Alamos National Laboratory owns approximately 20,000 reels of motion picture film. And we started our collection back during World War II, during the Trinity test. The Trinity test, of course, was the world's first nuclear weapons test. They weren't filming it just for history's sake. They were filming it because they wanted good pictures of the fireball, because they would be able to calculate the yield of the test.
We wanted to preserve the data that we recorded on these films so that future generations of nuclear weapon physicists can reanalyze the films and actually use it as a training aid. We bought a film scanner so we could digitize it. We use modern computer techniques to reanalyze the films. We can actually set boundaries that we can go in and we can get a very accurate measurement of what the shock wave is. And from that, we can come up with a more accurate yield measure.
Nitrate film was used for years and years. It was very popular because it was very strong. A movie theater, for instance, they could run that film over and over again. It would break. It was ideal. The problem, though, it's highly flammable. What makes it particularly dangerous is that if it catches on fire, it produces its own oxygen. So it's not going to go out. It's going to keep burning. And so there were several tragic theater fires in the 20s and the 30s that happened as a result of using this type of film.
When they were filming Crossroads, that was in 1946, they were still using cellulose nitrate. A typical black and white film made out of cellulose nitrate can only last 10, 15 years. So some of the films that were done, that were recorded back during the Crossroads operation, some of those films are basically decomposed.
The Crossroads film was one of only 3 cans out of the 20,000 reels that had deteriorated to the point that there was nothing to be salvaged. And it was decided that the best way, the most thorough way, and the quickest way to get rid of this hazardous substance was to actually detonate it.
3, 2, 1.
It went from being a very serious hazard to very quickly not existing at all. We have other Crossroads original films that we have and that are going to be digitized in the coming years. But the film, unfortunately, that was on that reel, the information is lost.
The nitrate film has survived and it stays in the vault. And Los Alamos now stores these in refrigerators in order to slow down the decomposition process. After 100 years, there's basically nothing you can do to that film to return to dust. And so we're already about 60 years into that process. That data is irreplaceable. We are never, ever going to do another atmospheric test. The data that we have is it. We want to preserve it. This is very important that we get this project done as soon as possible before we lose more films.
So there were other ways that were proposed to get rid of it, but Alan really liked to blow things up. That was his call. He just said, "Yeah, I'm going to blow this up." We said, "Okay, let's go ahead and do it." Let me find that PowerPoint again. Naturally, it starts at the very beginning, right? Let's see if I can go through this real quick. All right, so there's Trinity. That's where we left off. So, some of the details about how we actually scan these films. Again, the films have all shrunken, and they have all curled and buckled and twisted and so forth, and you can't run it through a sprocket type scanner. The scanning industry was a niche industry for about 15 years down in Hollywood. Hollywood wanted to scan every film they ever made and get rid of the original films. So people were building these scanners, and there must have been, I don't know, 100 companies that were scanning films, but they were told to scan brand new prints. And so they built sprocket machines and worked to get really perfect registration of each frame so the film wasn't flickering when you were watching it in the movie theater. But we couldn't do that. We had these shrunken films, and we had to have some sort of system here that was sprocketless. So I went to Sweden, and we talked to this company over here, Image Systems, who told us they could build a sprocketless system here where it was casting driven, which is basically two rollers that pinch the film between it, and you kind of spin the rollers and the film moves with it. And they had two cameras up here. This one camera captured the frame as it came through and took a picture of it. This other camera just looked at the perforations, and it lined up the perfs such that they would get the frames perfectly lined up from one frame to the next. So it was a sync camera. They call it a sync camera in order to keep the frames from drifting. They know when to stop the film. So this particular transport system here moves the film through this lighthouse here. This camera here takes a snapshot of it, and you get a nice picture. And so we had a sprocketless system, and we also wanted non-contact gates. Most gates, they try to take the film, and if the film is just slightly curled, then you would expect part of the film to be in focus and part of it to be out of focus. And if we did that, then we would end up potentially scratching the films and making the emulsion worse. So we said we could live with the out of focus problem here as long as we don't damage the film. So we have non-contact gates. We don't close anything on the film to flatten it out, which makes, again, some of the films make a little the edge look a little out of focus. It's a true frame-by-frame scan. There are scanners out there that don't scan frame-by-frame. They actually do superposition frames. But this one is a true frame-by-frame scanner, and it's 12-bit camera depth. Very important. The film itself has an optical depth. You can go from 0 to 4 on the density, and it's basically continuous. It's a smooth function here. But when you start to digitize it with a digital camera, the bit depth of the camera determines how many tones you can record. So if you have an 8-bit camera, a black and white camera, you can only record 256 tones of gray. If you have a 12-bit camera, you can record 4,096 tones of gray. So we went to the 12-bit. When we bought this, the 16-bit camera wasn't ready yet. There was a camera that's actually made of 16-bit that allows you to get 65,536 tones of gray. But we said, okay, 4,000 is enough for us. For what we're going to do with it, we don't probably need more than that. So we have a 12-bit camera for the black and white, and all colored cameras come as 8-bit, because if you take 8-bit, you have 256 cube, and that's the number of colors that you get. So you got like 13 million colors from a 8-bit RGB camera. The spatial resolution is also a big problem. You have film, and it's continuous, right? A nice smooth function here, and I want to talk about this microfile film, but it's very, very smooth. It's basically analog. And then you're digitizing, you're turning it into pixels. And so you're losing spatial information because of that process. So we were trying to scan it in the highest resolution possible for us. And again, when we bought this 5 years ago, this is it. So for a 16 millimeter, it was scanned at 2K, which means that basically you had 2K in one direction, in this direction here, and then about 1,000 pixels in this direction. And for a 35 millimeter, it's called 4K because you have 4,000 pixels in this direction, 2,000 in that direction. And then the 70 millimeters is scanned in 8K resolution. So this was about it 5 years ago. Now, 10 years from now, somebody's going to come out with a much better digital camera that's going to give you better spatial resolution, and they're probably going to want to do this project over again, which is fine. But for now, this is what we have. Now, the whole point of the scanner, this was very important for us, is here's a picture of one frame. And it has on here a sort of a pixel pattern, a density pattern here, that if you were to measure the optical density with a densitometer, at this particular point here, you want the scanner to give you the same identical density. We want an exact copy from the density standpoint. And density is just a measure of how dark the film gets when you expose it to light. So what we wanted to do was make sure that if we measured the optical density at any point there, then on this point over here, the scanner gave us the same optical density. It took us 1.5 years to calibrate this machine to get it to do that. They made something like 6 different changes to their software until they finally got the optical density right. And again, it was because they designed a system for Hollywood. Hollywood doesn't care about the optical density. When they scan a film, they know it's going to be off. And then they hire a color professionalist, a professional colorist, that's what it is. Professional colorist who goes in there and tweaks the colors anyway. He wants it to look pretty for you when you go to the theater. So they don't care if the density is off or not. So this company didn't care either, but when I did the calibration, it took about a year and a half for us to get it right. All right. So we also only scan originals. And the reason is if there's one original in the camera, that's the film that comes out of the camera. Okay, and that contains the raw data. And as long as that data hadn't faded over time, you're okay. If you make a copy of it, what normally happens is they go from a negative film stock to a print stock, and it changes the contrast of the film. That is, the whites look whiter and the blacks look blacker, and it looks much more contrasty. And that's because the optical density range of a print stock is only 0 to 2. The negative stock was 0 to 4. So you lose information when you make a copy. Then they would make a dupe negative from it, and from that dupe negative, they would make hundreds and hundreds of projection prints. So it turns out that we scanned one of those projection prints just to compare it with one of the originals. You can see the difference between the two. This is what happens. This basically is a third-generation copy, and this is a scan of the original. So we only scan negatives for the scientific project, for my project, but Alan says we got a bunch of prints, and we also want those scanned just for historic reasons. So big difference there. The overall objective, the scientific objective. First, we want to scan all the films and archive the data. So this is what Alan wants. This was his number one goal here, was give you the data after you've done it. Number two, my boss said I wanted to have more more accurate yield determinations. And so that was my primary goal, was to go back, reanalyze these films using computer technology and come up with more accurate yields. And then we also had some other things related to shock, post-detonation physics, the shock phenomena, light output, thermal blast, cloud formation, and nuclear fallout. And then we wanted this to be a community project. We wanted people to be able to share. We wanted to share this data with everybody that was out there. And so our goal was to get everybody else involved in this project. And then we wanted this data to be benchmark data so we could validate our computer codes and come up with more physics models. So we have a lot of people involved here. We're taking the lead on the science part. Los Alamos is participating, and I also have some scientists working on it. Sandia, the same thing here. The DITRIAC is a film archive down in Albuquerque on Kirtland Air Force Base. They're involved. And of course all the naval cadets and the West Point cadets and so forth. And scientists from AWE are involved in this project. So a lot of people involved in it. Not sure if this is really that important to talk about, but here on the yield estimate here, we were able to drive the uncertainty. Not only get a better answer for the yield, but we were able to drive the uncertainty of that yield down from about plus or minus 10% down to less than plus or minus 1%. So we not only got a more accurate yield, but it's more precise. And it's because we were able to analyze more films, and we were able to do a better job of it. So here's statistically, here are all the films we analyzed for Climax, and we ended up with a yield down here that was like 60 kilotons plus or minus 0.3 kilotons. Very accurate, very accurate. So this has been a big success for us here. Also in the shockwave physics, we had some guys running a computer code called HiChem, and they said, could you give us some of your Rapatronic plots so we could compare it to our shockwave solution to see if they agree. So here are the Rapatronic plates from Climax, and you can see that it agrees with their computer codes very well, very nicely. They really like that. And we were also doing late cloud modeling. We were looking at cloud formation and comparing it to our computer models. And again, we're getting very good comparisons of the models with the data. You can get very accurate cloud heights off of the films. And from all this data, we're also able to formulate new and improved correlations. Typical correlations from nuclear data is scattered maybe plus or minus 20%. This particular set of data here on this particular correlation was the asymptotic radius of the fireball is about plus or minus 1%. This is phenomenal here in order to see this from what they had from EG&G. We're very proud of that. And from the light output, we talked a little bit from the street cameras. We're also looking at the FastTAC cameras and looking at light output, and we're seeing structures down here that nobody's ever seen before. And the code guys went back and they started looking at their models, and sure enough, they started looking at this in more detail, and they're starting to see it. And they're going, whoa, where'd that come from? So this is kind of important here. So these were airdrops, and then we did the same thing on some tower shots, which are more massive. And even more structure down here from the tower because of all that extra metal that was associated with the elevator cab. So a lot of extra detail in here. And this is the kind of data that we've been looking for. So the status, Right now, again, we think there are about 9,000 films out there. And right now, we have scanned from the scientific films, from the above ground test, we've scanned about 3,800, 3,900 of those films, about 6.6 million frames. Alan has had us scan about 122 of these, just because he wants to talk about them in forums like this. And so in total, we've got about 4,000 scanned, about 7.3 million frames scanned so far. We can scan about 20,000 frames per day, so it's going to take us another couple of years to get through the rest of the atmospheric test films. And for Alan, a little bit more difficult. They got so excited about this, they went out and they bought themselves a scanner. So this scanner here is called the Director. It's built by a company down in Los Angeles, actually in Irvine. And they have about 20,000 films in their archives, and this includes the 9,000 scientific films. They purchased the first scanner in May, just a few months ago, and they liked it so much they decided to purchase a second one because they knew it was going to take 15 years to scan all of their films. So they said we needed to double the rate, so they bought 2 of these scanners here. And we went down, actually they came up to us, and they spent a week with Jim and Pete, and they trained them how to handle film and run scanners and so forth. And then Jim went down there for 2 weeks and spent time with them teaching them how to run this. And so right now, up to this point, they've scanned about 100 films so far, and about 1.6 million frames. That should be a comma. And then the third team here is the DITRIAC. This is the Defense Threat Reduction and Information Analysis Center down in Albuquerque. They also have 20,000 films in their collection, but these were mostly prints. So when EG&G was doing this, they would take like 10 Fireball films and they would put them together on one reel, on one piece of film, and they call it a reel. And they would then make these projection prints and pass them out to all the various commands around the country that were involved in nuclear testing. And these things were sitting in closets and boxes and they were rotting away. And so somebody from DITRA said, we should collect all those and put them in one place. And they chose the DITRIAC to do it. So DITRIAC has about 20,000 films. Most of them are prints. That means they're 3rd generation copies. Scientifically, they're not very valuable, but historically they are. And so they bought one of these scanners also. They did it back in December there, but because of funding issues, they haven't been able to hire a scanning tech. Strange thing to do, but anyway, it's been sitting there, so they got 20,000 films they haven't even started on their collection yet. All right. There are some extra articles here. You're welcome to these slides if you want. If you want to, you can just email me, and I will send you a copy of the slides. But there's an online magazine called Wire.com that did an article on this particular project, and they also Los Alamos did an entire publication on their nuclear security science publication. Comes out quarterly. They did an entire journal on this particular project. It was really nice. It came out about 6 months ago, and you can get an online copy of that right here. And then, of course, the Atomic Heritage Foundation on their site, Alan gave them a bunch of these films that we released to the public, and they're there, so you can get a copy of those too. So I have one more film, and you can ask me questions while the film's running, but basically Pete put together 30 films that we had that he kind of liked, and he said, I'll just put it together as one continuous running film, and you can just sit there and watch the different shots go off. You can ask questions at that point. Now let me get the film started. There somewhere. Okay. Start at the very beginning. So this is just a sampler of a bunch of shots. And I'll entertain questions. You can sit and watch these for a few minutes if you like. This film takes about 10 minutes to go through all 30 shots here, but really some fascinating shots here. Here was the 100-ton test that was done before Trinity. This is the first time I'd ever seen it. Los Alamos had a copy of this, the original, and they said, we really want to see this one, because I'd never seen the 100-ton test on the internet.
Question, your scanners, does it, so it syncs with this box and it takes a photo?
Yes.
Okay, does the next one syncs?
Yes. So it's perfect alignment, so the film isn't jittery.
Okay, and control over your light source also?
Yes, we calibrate it every day. The light source is calibrated because the light bulb gets weaker and weaker every day as you run it. This was the Harold Agnew film that was Hiroshima. It was mislabeled. Pete put the wrong placard on it. He said it was Nagasaki, but it was actually Hiroshima. This is probably the most often seen film anywhere. We scanned the original of it, so we now have a digital copy of the original. And Pete cleaned it up. It's a really nice film. This is Operation Sandstone. I'm going to stop this one right here. There was a one film format. I just want to pause this for a second.
These shots weren't all done at the test site, were they? They were done in the Pacific?
I'm sorry?
These shots were
They were either the test site, NTS, or PPG. It was a combination. We just have all of them. It's just the whole operation. It doesn't matter whether it's Los Alamos or Livermore.
Was Trinity down here?
I'm sorry?
Was Trinity down here?
What is it, Trinity? Everything's, that's of course.
Oh, that was the first one.
That was the very first one.
Okay, now I
Okay.
see.
This was a special film that was used during Sandstone by the Air Force. They said, you know, we want to capture the shock wave. Instead of running the camera at 3,000 frames, we want to effectively run it at 6,000 frames. So they used a special format called a double 8mm. This is actually two 8mm images superimposed on a 16mm film. So they ran the camera at 3,000 frames per second, but two images per frame, they got 6,000 frames per second. But it turned out that the image was too small for them to get an accurate measure of the shock wave, so they had better time resolution, but worse spatial resolution. So they finally abandoned it. But all of Sandstone, all of the films from Sandstone are in this double 8mm format.
Who did the photography on the set?
That was done by the Air Force. Is the room dark enough that you can see this, or these images? Okay.
We can turn it down lower if it didn't
If
help.
it's easier to see. So here's another Sandstone shot. I like this one because it should be pulled around here. Number two.
Yeah, number two, yeah, that's what I was.
There we go.
There we go. I was gonna go through all of them, but yeah.
So the streaks we see, are those the lines that you were talking about?
The scratches or?
Yeah.
Yeah, most of them are scratches. And we don't doctor anything up because once you start doctoring up, you're changing the optical density, you're changing the real data. These are some of the color films that they used that were fading away. Pete went and kind of restored some of the colors. Here's a fireball film from Ranger. You can see some of the scratches and stuff that show up. And the film was jittery. All those cameras out there in NTS, the wind was blowing, and the photo trailer was swinging back and forth. So I have 4,000 of these. I think we should stay here and watch them all.
Nobody's got any plans, right? No?
2009, 2001.
Greg, I have a question about, you've determined a lot of the yields now to very high precision. How does it compare with what calculations from really old codes would have predicted? Do you see any trends?
Well, you know, as a designer, you go in there and there are a bunch of knobs in your code, and you twist it until you finally get it to match the yield. So I went to the designer to these primaries, and I said, if you twisted the knobs a little different, could you get this yield? And they said, sure. And so they adjusted. So.
No, I was thinking about what the original calculation would have predicted for some of these shots.
You know, I haven't done the literature search on that to see what the.
That would be really
That would
interesting
be.
to know, to see,
See
how
close.
good were they at calculating with much, less computing power.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. You can see this color film, he's got this yellow streak up here.
Yeah.
Again, it's starting to get damaged and fall apart. You can see the yellow over here. This was an underground shot. The first underground shot at the Nevada test site was a cratering shot. We went there. We did. Karen and I have been to all the ground zeros. Karen was the RCT that went out there and helped me collect soil samples from all the GZs. And look how clear this film. This is amazing. This film. When you see this on a high resolution screen, I mean, this was nice on the screen here, but this is a low resolution QuickTime mode. When you see this in high definition on a good screen, it's unbelievable.
How far are these cameras away usually?
Depending on what the yield was, but most of the yields out of the NTS, the cameras were anywhere from 3,000 meters out to 5,000 meters away. From out in the Nevada or out in the Pacific areas, sometimes 50 miles away on different islands. This particular shot here was King. This was the highest yield fission-only device developed by the United States. It had a yield of about 500 kilotons, but it was fission only. This was the highest yield airdrop performed at the Nevada test site. This was Climax, 61 kilotons. And these streamers that you see here, they were used to measure the shock wave as it separated from the fireball. The shock wave disappears off the film, but it makes an optical illusion with those smoke trails, and you can tell where the shock wave is. Again, this is interesting with Pete. I told him just pick out 30 films and put them together. He liked the Bravo. This was a barge shot. They did a lot of shots out of the Pacific where they put the weapon on top of a barge and they would detonate it. They would moor it over deep water and detonate some shots. They did 36 barge shots all total. And this is my favorite.
Yeah.
Yankee. This fireball is 2.5 miles in diameter. 2.5 miles. Okay? If you're traveling at 60 miles an hour, you're traveling at 1 mile a minute. The drive across the diameter of that fireball takes you 2.5 minutes going 60 miles an hour. That's a big fireball. This was a big airdropper in Operation Dominic. This fireball is 2 miles in diameter here, and it was filmed from an airplane. I'm not sure how they stabilized the camera to do that, but this was, again, was a huge fireball, huge detonation shot. Big airdrop. This is a balloon shot. You can see the top of the balloon up here. Kind of makes a little cap on the top of it. When I slowed it down, you can see the balloon actually get sucked into the fireball. Do you see the scratches? That was quite damaged. We did a lot of safety tests to see if the devices were 1 point safe. This one wasn't. This is Coulomb B. This was out in Tony Valley.
Yeah.
Coulomb. And then they also did this next film here. This was done on a mountain. This was one of the tunnel shots. The camera was on one of the mesas looking back towards the other mesa. You can see the ground was shaking and the camera was moving. And then it created an avalanche. You can see the side of the mountain there fall off. Big surface shot. This was a high altitude shot. This was a rocket shot. It was out in outer space. It was one of the 2 first rockets that were shot. There was pink and orange. It actually wasn't quite in outer space. It was up about 40 miles or so. And I'm going to stop on this one here for just a second. This particular film is a film of a crate or a shaft that's drilled. So when we went underground, we started drilling these big holes, 6 foot diameter, whatever. And before they actually lowered the physics package into the hole, they would take a camera, it was called a fisheye camera, it was on a cable, and they would lower this very rapidly to the bottom of the hole, and then they would drag it up very slowly, and they would film the different strata in the geology where they drilled the hole. So I showed this because I wanted this next shot that was actually the beginning of the underground testing. Continue on with this one. So this is one of the holes. This shot here was a shaft, but it wasn't stem. And so this shot was underground in this shaft, but they didn't put any sand or gravel on top of it, so all the gases just shot straight up again. So this was an unstemmed hole. And they did several of those during Hard Attack 1 and 2. And here's one they put in a bunker. There was the bunker. No fireball, the gases were just blowing out the side of the bunker. We get another shot that was supposed to be 1 point safe. It wasn't quite. Then In 1962, they started a whole bunch of operations. There were like 7 operations that occurred in 1972. This was part of Operation Nougat. This was up on Buckboard Mesa. This was a cratering shot that was done in hard rock, basalt. Karen and I have been up there a few times. Bighorn was the second largest airdrop ever performed by the United States. The biggest one was Housatonic. This was the second biggest one. We don't have a film yet of Housatonic. And then we have some cratering shots here. Sudan. This was done in 1962, just about 2 weeks before the very last atmospheric test was done. Nevada test site, it was called the Low Funnel 1. That was the one that Robert Kennedy came up to see. So this was Sudan, and over in Buckboard Mesa, they did Low Funnel 1. Here's the launch, right here, there's a missile. They launched it out of a rocket launcher, and it shot at 1.7 miles away, and that was the detonation. It happened about 10 feet above ground. Karen, I'm in there a few times too. And this is my favorite. I gotta stop the film on this one. I say this because when I was a kid, back it up a little bit. My dad was in the Navy, and he was stationed on Midway Island in 1962. And so he came home one day and said, "We're gonna go out and see an atomic bomb." I was 11 years old. I was an atomic bomb dad. Anyway, he took us out. This shot was called Starfish Prime. It was 1.4 megatons. It was 237 miles up. It was over Johnson Island, which was about 400 miles south of Midway. It was shot at 10 o'clock at night, and when it went off, the sky lit up like it was noon. And it took about 15 minutes for all the different colors to fade away before it turned back to pitch black again. So this was the shot that I got to see, my one atmospheric shot.
Is that a ship in the foreground?
That was an airplane wing. We told us that was an airplane. Yeah, that's an airplane. You know, again, this was 237 miles up in outer space. So this is Starfish Prime. Started up in here. Yeah, the film is actually, every frame was taken about once every 15 or 20 seconds. This was Buggy. This is one that they did a cratering shot where they had 5 detonations go off almost simultaneously. They started with the center one, and they kind of worked their way out, and they tried to make a big canal here. This is part of the plowshare program. Another plowshare shot here is called Cabriolet. You can see these colored films are kind of faded. Pete kind of doctored them up a little bit, but they're still kind of grainy looking. And this was sweeter. This was in hard rock. This was a bigger version of Danny Boy. Danny Boy was a half a kiloton, and this was 31 kilotons. It would throw rocks that were the size of a car several miles away from the crater. That's how much energy was involved. And again, this is a good shot for me. I want to stop this one for just a second here. When they stopped doing testing, atmospheric testing, they went underground. And underground shots, they would take a shaft and they put the weapon down in it. And when it exploded, there's a lot of air and soil. And what happens is this thing vaporizes and the pressure pushes the air out basically and densifies the soil in this outer ring where the shock wave kind of pushes up against the rock. And it makes a hole, it makes a cavity. Okay, and then if there's too much weight above, then all that dirt kind of settles down and makes a subsidence crater. And this was a subsidence crater. This is typical of 800 shots that we did after the atmospheric testing. They did the shot, you can see the subsidence crater that get formed here. It's just all that dirt collapsing into a hole. So the atmospheric testing is done at this point, and all the other tests are now of this type here of urine, subsidence craters. And that was the last film. And there's a, thanks to Pete and Jim Moy for doing that. Scanning the film and putting it together. Okay. Any other questions? They had 50 cameras on Trinity, so there are several of them survived. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but you said all the original Trinity film.
Oh, there are 6 of them that disintegrated. There were still some originals that were still in existence, yeah.
So that was an original film.
That was an original, yeah. There were 50 cameras on Trinity in addition to a lot of still photograph. But the cameras themselves, the motion picture cameras, are about 50 that were on there. So, but several of them have survived. Yeah, but some of
pictures of every shot except for Nagasaki?
They don't have Nagasaki because they kick the cameraman off, but yeah, for every atmospheric shot and even underground shot, they always film it. They always film the shot. But it turned out, I think about 20% of all underground shots leak. I think that was a number I heard. I go quote me on that, but they wanted to film it just in case it was a leaker, so they always had a camera on it. Make sure. And they were also looking for the ground shot. They could actually see the ground shot from on the surface.